Do your kids or loved ones all talk to you at the exact same time, overlapping in their conversations, and expect for you to hear the conversation and also respond back? But in reality, if you did that to them, there would be lots of frustration. Or when you're sick, is the expectation that you're able to carry all the responsibilities and the mental and physical load as if it's normal? But when others are sick, the expectations are quite different. If you've answered yes to this, there's some boundary issues and maybe expectations as well that are going on in your neurodiverse family. And I would love to begin talking to you about how boundaries are very much connected to seeing our self-care being carried out. Hey friend, do the daily demands of family life leave you exhausted with no time for yourself? Ready to make self-care and healthy boundaries a natural part of your day, all while embracing your roles as a wife and mom? Well, I'm so glad you're here. I'm Christina, married 16 years to a neurodiverse man, mom of 3 neurodiverse kids, and many more roles. Welcome to the Moms and Neurodiverse Families podcast. Get ready to begin your self-care journey. Grab your Sante latte and listen in as we take a small step towards a healthier you. So boundaries was not really on my radar when I first got married and then began having kids and our family began to grow. But as time moved along, I really began to see how boundaries were an issue. Now, maybe you can relate to the situation. In a neurodiverse family, there are oftentimes the preference for patterns and for expectations of how life should go. So if I am normally a very go, active person, I'm very responsive to my spouse and my kids' needs, and they become expectant that that is who I am and how I respond. I become sick, and the expectation doesn't change though. Depending on the situation, it may or may not be from a selfish perspective. It may be their viewpoint of what's happening is not considering, oh, well, Christina, our mom is sick, and therefore there's going to change some of the expectations that we have for her and what she can do. Now, in some situations, could a family be dealing with some selfishness from the others? Definitely. But oftentimes there's this mind blindness, not understanding what's going on in the other person's life. And so I experience this expectation of, why aren't you doing this? Why is this not happening? And I would be like so sick and barely able to get around. And I would try to meet the expectation because I thought I'm being a loving and caring wife and mom. And when these situations would repeat themselves, and as other problems and challenges came around, I began to realize there were limits that I had, God-given limits, which we talked about in a previous episode that were given. You cannot push an engine beyond certain points. And as a person, we cannot push ourselves beyond certain points. And I did not want to acknowledge that because I had always this lots of energy and ability, but also I wanted to be loving and caring. When I began seeing how there was sometimes a lack of understanding, and sometimes there can be selfishness of not seeing my needs, I realized that my thought process of serving and of caring for someone else, and they would do it in return, that math formula was not working out in our neurodiverse family. It wasn't on their radar. And I realized that I needed to begin to have boundaries. Now, boundaries in my mind have become like peanut butter and jelly with self-care. So how peanut butter and jelly go together, peanut butter and chocolate. Sorry if you get hungry after listening to this. How they go together so well. And boundaries and self-care are the same way. We need boundaries to be able to care for ourselves. And how I see boundaries is that they're like an invisible wall of our person and our character, and they are meant to be a healthy protective system of our mental, emotional, physical, sexual, and spiritual areas of our life. They are meant to protect who we are. Now, others may not see these boundaries, either because of their own life experiences, or maybe because of neurodiversity, or others choose intentionally not to respect those boundaries. But we do know when they're being crossed if we know what to look for. Now, for those of you from a faith perspective, I like to take you back to the Bible, and because oftentimes the question will come up, well, boundaries really aren't biblical, are they? And I would say, oh, yes, they are. They are. And just like in the book of Esther, when someone looks in the book of Esther and they look for God's name in there and they don't find it, and if they use that logic to say, well, that book shouldn't be in the Bible, there would be such great wealth that would be lost, right? So, in the same thing here, the word boundary is used in the Bible, usually talking about geographical areas, but boundaries are also continually referred to in the Bible. And then the first times we see it with human beings is with Adam and Eve and in the Garden of Eden. Now, God had told Adam that there's this boundary around the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that you should not cross this boundary, because if you do, something bad will happen to you. So God put a boundary around Adam because it was a healthy boundary, because he was loved and he was cared for. And we know what happened when that boundary was crossed. And we put this boundary around our kids. So if you're not from a faith perspective, because you love your kids or because you love your spouse or your parents or whoever, when you know they have a food allergy and they're about to eat something that has that food allergy, you put up a boundary, say, no, don't eat that, because there are going to be consequences for them. Now, even going further, another sign of boundaries is when God was creating Israel and giving them a government and an identity. He had physical boundaries, as in these are the actual boundaries of your country, but he also had spiritual and social boundaries. And those boundaries would demonstrate that these people here are special and unique and loved. And also that it would demonstrate the fact of how God loves his people and cares for them, and to protect God's people from influences that could hurt and corrupt them. And so these boundaries, again, are showing that there is a beginning and end to that person and that they are cherished and loved. So that is how I see and try to explain boundaries, that I'm a person who's loved and cherished. My spouse and my kids, the same, everyone. And those boundaries are meant to protect. Now, healthy boundaries, not talking about selfish expectations. So there's a difference there, and we'll talk more about this. Why are boundaries important? The reason why is when healthy boundaries are being crossed, there is a cost. I'll say it again. When healthy boundaries are being crossed, there is a cost. Healthy boundaries are meant to protect, and they also highlight what is important and what is cherished in our life and what is important to others. We're always looking at these boundaries to protect what is important and loving to us. When that boundary is crossed, the impact is felt. For example, I taught my kids from a very young age, the stove is a hot spot. We do not touch that. That was a boundary because I love them and I care for them. And there was a cost that they crossed that boundary. And you can guess it. It was burnt fingers or a sore in their hand from the hot pan. Being a mom in a neurodiverse family, I know very well if they get a blister or injuries, that not only is there the normal kids' difficulties with dealing with the injury, there is another level of sensory challenges. Can I put a Band-Aid on it? Can I put treatment on it? Would they allow me? Because sometimes the salve might be smelly to the child, or they are not wanting to have a Band-Aid, or it hurts so much that they're just crying and screaming for the next 2 hours. So that healthy boundary was really important because there was such a high cost, and also for me as well, because I would need to be spending this extra amount of time caring for something that never should have happened if we respected that boundary, that line. Maybe you can identify for yourself. There has been a cost when your boundaries have been crossed over, when your energy level and your ability to carry out activities has ended, and yet there were demands that were continually placed on you, you said no. Or maybe you didn't say no. Maybe you didn't feel like you could. The expectation and then was there, and you didn't respect your boundaries, what your body was telling you, your mind was telling you, and you kept pushing on. And then there were consequences. You had a flare up with whatever chronic illness you're dealing with. Or the next day, you could barely get out of bed. Or maybe even it impacted the job that you're working at. There was a cost. So, how do we know when our boundaries are being crossed? Depending upon your childhood and your early years of adulthood and your current life, your boundary radar is what I will call it. That radar that tells you my boundaries are being crossed may barely be functioning right now. It may have a very low ability to realize boundaries are being crossed at that moment. And what we need to do is making sure that we do some maintenance and make sure that radar is turned on and we are aware. And that was me for some time. I didn't realize that my boundary radar was turned off because I'm going to use my background is in emergency management and weather. So I'm going to use some analogies from there. To know there is a storm coming, the radar has to be working for the National Weather Service to see what is the storm, how severe is it, and once they know there is a storm, they can issue the warnings and watches. Now, let's say that radar is turned off for maintenance. Then the Weather Service radar is not going to know there is a storm coming, and there could be a cost for that, damage cost for people's property. So what we need to do now is have your radar turned on, your boundary radar, so you can be aware when there are boundaries being crossed. Because if you don't know they're being crossed, you can't take the next step, which is to support and reenact that boundary of no, this won't happen, or no, you cannot do that. Also, you may not know this, when it comes to looking at the weather radar, you have to be trained to know what you're looking at, because sometimes you can look at the radar and you can think that's a storm. No, it's actually a humongous flock of birds that are closer to the radar site. Or if it's a storm, that actually could be debris that's showing up. And also understanding how strong is that storm? How big? Is this a small storm or a big one? And same thing with our boundary radar. We need to know, is this a small boundary crossing, which requires a redirect, or is this a major boundary crossing? And we have lots of work to do with this relationship or this situation. So being able to read the radar is very important. So if you have, as I have, my boundary radar was not functioning very well, not very aware, this single tip may help you. When you become upset or frustrated when interacting with another person, that is a sign there could be a boundary issue. This will take time to figure out if there is a boundary being crossed, because sometimes what we think is a boundary issue is really a whole different problem. For example, let's go back to that food allergy. So let's say you have a food allergy or intolerance, and there is someone bringing you a meal because of sickness in the family. And that's so great they're doing it. And you expressed there is a food allergy in the home and you need food without that specific item, whatever that would be. Your friend brings over the food and they explain to you like all the work and time they put into it. And they say that ingredient and you're like, oh my goodness. It could be one, they completely forgot. They didn't cross a boundary. They just completely forgot. And you need to remind them very gently and they will feel awful afterwards, right? But that isn't a situation where your friend was trying to intentionally cross a boundary. But now let's change this around. Let's say your friend decides, you know what? I have a very limited amount of time. I am making them this meal and Christina's just going to be glad that she's getting this meal. And I will use whatever ingredients I decide, and she just needs to be thankful for it. Because really, how bad is it? And she makes a meal, my friend brings it over, and tells me all the work and time and the ingredients in there. And when I make a comment saying, well, thank you so much, but I'm allergic to X, Y, and Z. And her response is, well, guess what? Just tough cookies, just deal with it. That is an example of a boundary being crossed because you've expressed what you needed for health reasons. Naturally, you would feel upset that planning on the meal being provided by your friend and they decided to do this, you're upset because if it's your food allergy or if your child's, then what do you do? And this is where, again, being upset or frustrated or even sad can be a sign there maybe is a boundary crossing happening. Now, I'm going to use a different example where at first it could seem a boundary is being crossed. In reality, there's some selfishness in there. So, when I was first pregnant and my spouse and I were on a trip out west, I had morning sickness. There was a point when I was getting really just tired of fast food or just really just greasy, quick food. And I wanted something like a salad or a steak. I'm not sure what it was. We got to a restaurant really out in the middle of nowhere. And I saw the menu and I had this moment. It's kind of funny now to think about it. I had this moment of like, "Ugh, there's nothing here for me to eat. I won't even eat here at all." And it was this little pity party that I was having for myself. I was upset with my spouse for not providing me a place that would meet my needs for a restaurant. Now, yes, I was pregnant, and there's understandable that it's my first time being pregnant and having patience. When I look back at that, I can see that I was having that little pity party. And instead of being more open minded and being a little bit flexible of with the menu, I had this whole all or nothing moment happen. Like, well, I'm just not going to eat then, which really, what good is that going to do me? It's not going to help me at all. And when I can see that there was selfishness there, and instead of being like, why didn't my husband provide me a restaurant that I could eat at? Like, doesn't he care about me? Well, we were in the middle of the sticks. So, like, there was so many limitations that we had there. And that was my selfishness coming through. So, our radar, we need to become aware of what is happening around us, which means our minds are a little bit quieter and are a little slower processing so we can think about people's responses to what we say and do and to understand, is my boundary being crossed? Because you can have so many emotions coming at once of overwhelmed because there's a meltdown happening, you're pressured for time, and maybe your spouse is upset, and there's so many things going on at once that you can't process it all. And you may not know a boundary's been crossed until after this situation you're in is done with. Sometimes it took me 24 hours to like 2 days to be able to process all my different thoughts and feelings and realize, you know what? That was a boundary that was crossed there. So, right now, I would really encourage you reflect. Do you have your radar on so you know when your boundary is crossed? And if you don't, can you just begin observing what you're feeling? Now, our emotions are indicators there's something going on. It does not the truth, though, of the situation. So when we're feeling shame, overwhelmed, or whatever the emotions could be, those are just indicators of what's we're feeling, but it doesn't mean that we actually are those things. I really encourage you to, one, be aware of your feelings and to be looking, are my boundaries being crossed? Because if you do not have your radar turned on, and if you are not understanding when there's a boundary issue, you can't do the next step. Tell someone either no or reemphasize a past boundary, or maybe you need to explain a boundary because we didn't do it very well the first time. There was some nuances that was missing. So this is my question for you. What would it look like if you began being aware of boundaries being crossed? Maybe of expectations for you that is beyond your ability. What would you gain if you became aware and you were able to put up a boundary to allow you to do self-care just 1 hour a week? What would that mean for you? And when I started making the connections that by having awareness of my surroundings and when my boundaries are being crossed, awareness of what I'm feeling, those lead me to be able to express what I need and express when a boundary is crossed. Now, next week, we're going to discuss ideas how to handle when boundaries are being crossed. So a quick recap. Boundaries, they're biblical, they're in the Bible. They are meant to be a protection around us, and also it highlights what is important and cherished. When healthy boundaries are being crossed, there is a cost to us. And you need to be able to turn on your boundary radar so you're aware when your boundaries are being crossed and to be able to take the next step. Hey, thank you for joining me today. I pray this episode gave you encouragement to take one small step. If so, please leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help other women find this show. By the way, if you're loving this conversation and want more encouragement like this, join my email list at bit.ly/myselfcare. That is bit.ly/myselfcare. I have a planner launching soon that will help you put all this into action in your own life. I look forward to chatting with you again next week for another episode.